So firstly, a very warm welcome to you all and welcome to our CSWEF seminar today. So we're delighted to have you with us, and we know we've got people from a number of different backgrounds, and we're looking forward to having everyone's engagement in the discussion today. So we're particularly delighted to have Sarah Hallett with us today. So Sarah is the recently re-elected chair of the Junior Doctors Committee at the BMA, the British Medical Association. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the system, the term junior doctors covers doctors in training right up until they become consultants. And the BMA is the trade union and professional body for doctors in the UK. So within it, the Junior Doctors Committee represents the more than 50,000 junior doctors working on key issues and challenges that face them, for example, in relation to contracts, rights, education, training, well-being, which is obviously something very much at the fore in current times. So in the seminar today, Sarah's going to tell us her story of becoming the first female chair of the Junior Doctors Committee and becoming a national leader of the UK's junior doctors, and her experiences and challenges along the way, including the recent or last year's victory at the Court of Appeal around a test case about junior doctors' breaks and working hours. So we're going to run this as a kind of conversation in the sense that Paul is going to ask a number of questions. So a kind of light touch interview. It's not going to be anything formal, but Paul will ask a number of questions and Sarah will respond to those. We think that will be about 40 to 45 minutes or so. And we'll then open the floor to questions from all of you. Obviously, as we're going along, you can also put questions in the chat. And what I'll do is I'll make a note of those questions so that we can bring them up later. But after the 45 minutes, we'll hand over to you. So I think without further ado, we'll pass over to Sarah and to Paul to ask his opening question.
Sarah, I can't see you, Sarah. Is it?
If I speak, does that bring me up? There we go, I'm spotlighted.
Oh, there you go, you're being spotlighted, even better. So those people who don't know me, I'm Paul Brook, also co-director of CSWEF. And I'm going to be asking Sarah the questions as Catherine just explained, not least because if you put yourself in Sarah's position, it would be very weird just sat there talking about yourself in front of lots of strangers. I was going to say strange people, strangers. So I'm going to open up by basically asking Sarah, what happened in your background to make you want to be a doctor, and was there anything in your background about becoming a trade union activist as well?
So hi everyone, thank you for inviting me to come and speak today. I thought before I get to that question, I thought I might just really quickly explain what my role is. Would that be helpful, just as a bit more background information? So I'm Sarah. I am a junior doctor. So I'm currently a paediatric junior doctor. So I'm specialising in paediatrics. I'm taking a sort of slower meandering route through my training, but I am sort of on the pathway to becoming a paediatric consultant is basically what that means. I chair the UK Junior Doctors Committee at the British Medical Association. And as Catherine said, so the British Medical Association is the trade union and the professional association for all doctors across the UK. And so my role involves leading a committee of sort of 80 or so junior doctor representatives from around the UK. It's a democratic committee, so everybody on the committee essentially got there because they've been elected by their peers to represent them. And I'm no different from that. So I go through a process of being elected first by my region and then to the UK committee and then get elected as chair from there. And we work on issues affecting the lives of junior doctors, so education and training, regulation, and we hold the negotiating rights for the junior doctors contract as well in the UK. And we're the only trade union who have those rights for junior doctors, so that's a big responsibility and forms a large bulk of our work. But we also work alongside other organisations like NHS employers, the Department of Health and Social Care, the education training bodies for junior doctors, and people like the General Medical Council. So I started as chair of the committee in September 2019, and I've been on the committee itself at a UK level since 2013, which was when I first became a junior doctor. And I was deputy chair and led for education and training issues for 2.5 years before I took over the chairship in 2019. But even so, I would say it's still been a steep learning curve chairing the committee. So to go back to your original question, so medicine, why medicine, my background. So I grew up in Basingstoke in Hampshire. My parents are from a fairly working class background. Neither of them went to university when they first left school. My dad worked for the Ministry of Defence as a police sergeant, and my mum was largely a stay-at-home mum after being in the civil service for a brief period of time in kind of secretarial work. And then while I was sort of at and became a classroom assistant, and she subsequently has gone to university and is now a primary school teacher and involved in leadership within her school. So, but certainly when I was growing up, as I said, neither of my parents had been to university, and I don't think that they really foresaw that I would go to university either. I think it hadn't really crossed their minds until I was a little bit older in my school career, and it was suggested that that might be an option for me. So I was always very keen on science, and I was always very keen on engaging with other people, talking to other people, but I was drastically needle phobic as a child to the point where I had to have sort of psychotherapy at one point in order for me just to have teeth extracted. And so medicine had never really crossed my mind. Also, we had no doctors in the family. There wasn't within our social circles to have sort of doctors or medics. And so it wasn't, again, within my sphere of consciousness, I don't think. My dad suggested it a few times, that he thought that being a GP would be a pathway. But, you know, being a classic teenager, I didn't accept the suggestions of my dad at that time. And I wanted to be a vet when I was growing up. So again, sciencey and working with people, but also with animals. When I was 16, I underwent major spinal surgery to correct idiopathic scoliosis. And so firstly, I had to get over that needle phobia quite quickly, because once you've had a couple of chest drains in place, then a blood test doesn't seem quite so bad. And also it opened my eyes a bit more, I think, to the world of medicine and what doctors do and the difference that you can make to people's lives. So certainly for myself, I would have been in a wheelchair by my mid-20s if it wasn't for the surgery that I had at the age of 16. And so that really brought home the impact that the NHS has, as well as we wouldn't have been able to afford my surgery if we lived outside of the UK. And so again, that probably gave me the love that I have for the NHS that has continued and does continue now. So I went to college and went to do my A-levels, and like I said, I was interested in science, maths, and they were always subjects that I was very good at in school. And I, more by sort of luck than judgment, ended up at a talk for people who wanted to apply to UCAS early, including medicine, veterinary, Oxbridge. And I only recently had the spinal surgery, and so then sort of thought, actually, medicine does sound like something I'd be really interested in. Does listening to this sound like something would be a good fit for me? And so within a few years, I'd applied to medical school, and I think was lucky to get in, given that my lack of kind of work experience or anything at that point. But clearly they saw something at interview that they thought was worth offering a place to me for. So in 2008, I started at Nottingham University to study medicine. And I think given that, I consider myself very lucky that I have loved it from my first day of medical school, and I still love it as a career, and I wouldn't want to do anything else. I particularly love working in child health, and I'm very passionate about child health in general, and sort of socioeconomic health and things like that. So so that's a little bit about the background and how I ended up choosing medicine. I think I would always have chosen something vocational at university, partly because of my family background. And it's interesting, my sister has also gone into the vocational health route, so she's a pharmacist, despite us not having any particular kind of doctors in the family. So that's a bit about my background. What shall I go on to discuss next?
Well, I got a bit of feedback, sorry. You were talking about when you were at medical school, how you first came across the BMA and started to get involved as an activist in the union. Do you want to tell us a bit more about how you started off and getting interested in union work?
So I've always been somebody who was interested in being on committees and kind of getting involved, and I think that's been because I've always been somebody who liked to drive improvement. So even when I was in college, for example, I was president of our students' union when I was doing my A-levels, and I was a student governor, and so I've always kind of had an interest in wanting to improve things. So when I was at university, one of the roles that I ended up taking on was being chair of the Student Voice Committee at the time. And as a result of being chair of that committee, which largely fed into university matters, but it also had a link through to the British Medical Association. And so I ended up at a conference for medical students, and they were discussing the NHS and they were discussing the Health and Social Care Act. And that was something that I was very passionate about, was against the privatisation of the NHS. And I still feel very passionately about the fact that the founding principles of the NHS are that it is, free at the point of use and is there for all. And so I became involved in the BMA initially around campaigning against the Health and Social Care Act. And do
you want to just explain a bit more about the Health and Social Care Act?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was brought in by Andrew Lansley, who was Health Secretary at the time. And the main concerns essentially were around it leading to greater options for privatisation of various parts of the NHS and the fragmentation of the National Health Service. I think it has come to be largely seen, including by the political party who brought it in, as something of a failed approach, and indeed lots of the propositions that you see coming through now in politics, I think, are largely to try and undo it. But it essentially hinges on the concerns about privatisation, and that's kind of where my kind of passion for it came from, I think.
And were the BMA organising actively against that in the medical schools?
So I mean, they were. So maybe not in the medical schools, but certainly as an association, they were against it. Although, interestingly, the reason I first became involved was because I thought they weren't doing enough, and I wanted to see them doing more. And so that was what first brought me into the union, was a feeling that I felt that they should be doing more to oppose this. And there are some excellent activists within the BMA who were doing lots, and who led some excellent work in this area at the time. But I felt, as from the leadership, I didn't feel that there was enough being done. So I think it's quite a common thing, actually, to kind of get involved in an organisation because you disagree with something that they're doing and you want to change it. And then I've never really kind of looked back. But that was certainly the issue that got me involved first.
There was also a time as well when you were at medical school when there were large-scale student protests, particularly after the election of the coalition government in 2010, 2011. So did you get involved in any of that, or?
I wasn't. I was less kind of involved in the general student politics side of things, which now I look back on and I wish I had got a bit more involved. But I was very much wrapped up in sort of the kind of insular medicine kind of bubble. And so as much as I took an interest in politics, it was only really NHS marches and campaigns I would be out on the streets about at the time.
So you left Nottingham Medical School and you started your foundation training, and you went to, was it Derby General Hospital, was it?
Yeah, so the Royal Derby Hospital was my first job as a doctor.
So what happened there?
So the Royal Derby Hospital is an excellent hospital, and I genuinely really enjoyed my foundation year one there. However, there was one particular job where this is when I was working in the surgical department there, that some of the shifts felt unsafe, and some of them felt that the staffing was inadequate and we were rushed off our feet. And this was towards the end of my year working there, because it was my first job, but it seemed that this was something that happened throughout the year. So I undertook a survey of all of the F1s on the job, and we presented that.
You would just explain what an F1 is.
F1 is the name that we give to your first year out of medical school. So it stands for Foundation Year 1. So F1 is kind of a newly qualified doctor, and you have provisional registration with the GMC, but you get your full registration at the end of that year with the General Medical Council. So so I surveyed all the rest of the F1s, and it was clear that most F1s found that this particular rotation and these particular shifts were unsafe. And we presented that back to the surgical department, and they agreed eventually to change it, and they brought in extra staff, and they did listen to our concerns. The issue was within the contract that we were working on at the time, and this is the previous junior doctor contract, there are various different mechanisms, or there were various different mechanisms that should have picked up the fact that we were working in a way that was potentially unsafe. And one of those is monitoring the number of breaks that junior doctors get. And if junior doctors are unable to get their breaks on that contract, then the employer essentially has some quite big fines levied against them. And this never happened while I was working there, which was always somewhat baffling to me, because no one got their breaks when they were on these kinds of shifts. So later on, and I think it was either towards the end of when I was working in there or subsequently, I became involved in some with the BMA, and it seemed that my trust and the job I was working on was a very good example of essentially what we saw as employing trusts trying to circumvent the fine system so as not to pay the fines when junior doctors were not getting breaks. And the data from the place where I was working was a perfect example of where we saw them essentially cheating their way out of this system. And the way that it's quite complicated, but essentially what they were meant to do on this contract was they were meant to monitor your hours and your breaks for kind of a 2-week period. And in that time, you had to make a certain percentage of junior doctors getting their breaks and a certain percentage of people returning in order to make it a valid monitoring exercise. And what they were doing was essentially for people who weren't at work, so if they were on holiday, they were off sick, it was a rota gap, so there was no one in the slot, they were saying that those people got their breaks. And so they were artificially inflating the number of people who seemed like they were getting their breaks as junior doctors. On the flip side, they were looking at these kind of the returns for the number of people actually submitting their returns for this process. And again, they were including people who, for example, were away, or they were including rota gaps where there was no doctor, and they were saying these people haven't returned their monitoring and therefore this is an invalid exercise. So they were both artificially inflating the number of people who had their breaks, but also trying to make the exercises invalid, again, through means that didn't seem to make much sense. And so after various different kind of steps in this process, this ended up at the High Court. And
before you go on to that, so can you give people a sense of what that meant in practice, the type of work regime, the hours that you were working without food or drink or a rest of any sort?
I mean, I think the shifts in particular that we were most worried about were sort of ward cover shifts is what we called them. So these were often either in the evenings, at the weekends, or on night shifts, so out of hours shifts, where as a very new doctor, so this was within a few weeks essentially of starting as a doctor, we would be responsible for covering multiple wards, hundreds of patients, and quite often it would just be you and sort of one senior doctor. And sometimes that senior doctor, because I was a surgical working in surgery at that time, they would be in theatre and difficult to reach, and so it would just be myself as a very junior doctor covering hundreds and hundreds of patients, multiple of whom could be deteriorating at one time. You were also getting pressurized to try and discharge people. The job list was impossible to keep on top of, and it was an incredibly challenging situation. So it was the reason I raised it initially with the trust was because I felt that it was not safe. And as I said, they did respond to that, but then the breaks almost seemed like kind of a secondary consideration. It was hard enough to keep on top of everything, let alone also find time to eat and drink during the day. And these shifts could be up to sort of 12 and a half hours long. So yeah, they were very difficult, really difficult. And my understanding is that after we left, things did change, partly because of the work that we did to raise awareness amongst those in charge of the rotas about how challenging these were. But it certainly was yeah, very difficult while we were there. And like I said, I personally think that Derby is a very good example of an employer, and I'm sure that they were not the only ones doing this. It would have been
common practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they made that point when we went to the High Court, that this was not uncommon, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was right.
So how did it go in court?
So it eventually got to the High Court a couple of years ago. So I was by this time living and working in London. I was a few years into my career as a doctor, but still felt very strongly that this was the right thing to do. I myself wasn't asking for any sort of financial recompense. So I was only asking for the principle to be established, as much as I could have asked for the financial compensation. But for me, it was more about the principle that these clauses and these safeguards exist within our contracts for a reason, and it's to protect both the doctors and the patients. So we had pursued it all the way through to the High Court. And so that was an interesting experience. I learned lots about the law and the way it works, and went to the High Court every day for kind of four days as it was heard, and was cross-examined. And so that was also an interesting experience. It ended up only being in my name, as none of my colleagues on the rota kind of wanted to join me with the action. So the court case was Sarah Hallett versus Derby Hospitals, which again was an interesting experience. It was in the Daily Mail and various other newspapers, and they wrote sort of profiles on me, and people sort of hanging around outside the courts trying to talk to me, which was again all a bit an educational experience. Although I suppose I wasn't this wasn't my first time being featured in the Daily Mail, but I can come back to that. Due to kind of trade union activism. Anyway, so we had that, and unfortunately on that occasion we weren't successful. But when we read the judge's opinion, we felt quite strongly that we still had a very strong case, and so we did take it to the Court of Appeal after that. And I think that would have been 2019. I think that came June 2019 that came to the Court of Appeal. Just thinking if I've got that right, but I think that is right. And on that occasion we did win. So eventually through the Court of Appeal we won the case, and they ruled in our favour. And more recently, so April of this year, the Derby did try to take it to the Supreme Court, but were rejected. And so at that point the case was complete, and we were successful, which I think was obviously a huge relief after having kind of pressed for all of this, but also because for me it was about the principle. And actually I discovered sort of one of the things I think I learned was that in law you can have sort of the best principles, but unless you can make an argument in court, sometimes it can be quite challenging. And I think some of the arguments made against us seemed very absurd to me, but in the end our arguments won through, and that was great.
That was brilliant. I mean, a very notable success. Just taking you back, I mean, that was a 6-year struggle, and I think you underplay the tenacity and bravery of pushing against the medical establishment in the way you did, and I think that's why it's received the coverage that it did. But taking you back a bit, so can you just tell us the story, build on the story of your BMA involvement, and obviously going back, as you said, to the 2015-2016 national contract dispute, which culminated in the first national strikes in over 40 years.
Yeah. So I was initially elected to the UK committee as a rep from the East Midlands in 2013, which was in my first year as a doctor. And I have always sort of been a strong supporter of trade unionism. I mean, I think for me, trade unionism is about valuing your colleagues. It's about valuing your employees as human beings, and ensuring that they have safe working conditions, ensuring that they have autonomy in their working lives, that their environment is equipped to ensure they can do the job, but also then recognizing that they have lives alongside the work that they're doing. For me, this is just basic humanity, and that's again, and so for trade unionism, and it's about recognizing that when that we're better able to advocate for individuals in the system. When we join together, we support each other and press for improvements together. So it's just it just seems like a no-brainer for me when I first got involved. And it particularly, I think, is important in the healthcare setting as well, because again, I went into medicine because I'm interested in people. I wanted to help people, as well as enjoying the scientific side of it. And so I'm very interested in improving patient safety. Again, to be honest, my campaign at Derby started with being concerned about patient safety and the impact that was having. So again, for me, trade unionism in healthcare is around the fact that we know that if we support, value, kind of make sure that healthcare staff are well supported in the workplace and have what they need, then that will be better for their patients. And when you look at things like what happened at mid-staffs and the reports that came out of that, it was clear that difficulties in terms of the environment that staff were working in and them not being listened to, them not having autonomy, them being working under extreme pressure and their working rights not being upheld, were driving factors towards the impacts on patients. And so it all fits together into a system where it makes sense to listen to your employees and to listen to your colleagues and to work towards making sure that their working lives are fair and safe. So that was what drove me to get involved initially. And then, so I joined in 2013 and then I became chair of the East Midlands Committee when I was an F2, so my second year as a doctor in 2014, and also joined the executive committee of the UK Junior Doctors Committee at that time. And I was initially interested in education and training, and I'm still very passionate about training and ensuring that training is of good quality. However, that was obviously also the time that we were struggling with the contractual dispute. So in fact, I think it was about a week or so after I joined the executive, we reached an impasse with the government for the first time, and we withdrew from the talks on the contracts because they were essentially trying to force us, blackmail us into agreeing to things that were clearly not okay. So the initial kind of things they were trying to push upon us were kind of would have almost completely done away with any recognition of weekends, were trying to make us work more hours over the week, but without making it clear how they'd have more of us working at weekends without impacting on those working on weekdays. We have widespread rota gaps in this country for junior doctors, and so therefore you can't move some of us from one part of a working week, to a different part of a working week without having an impact. We aren't replete with doctors that we can just move around because we're already struggling with rota gaps. And so a lot of the proposals they were trying to push through, we were genuinely concerned about patient safety as a result.
Wasn't this the government had also, this is 2015, the government had just been elected on promising a 7-day-a-week NHS.
Absolutely, yeah. So the first time we walked away from talks was 2014, and it was just before the election. And so obviously then the general election happened, and it became very clear that the government that came in would be possibly even worse in terms of being able to work with them on this. And as you said, they became fixated on this notion of a 7-day NHS. And that was I think, a misstep from them in terms of their campaigning, because the NHS is 7 days a week. And junior doctors were also not the group to be targeting for this, because junior doctors work weekends almost more so than kind of other parts of the medical profession. We are the ones who are there day in, day out, 7 days a week. And so while I think there's a noble goal, I think, around making sure that it is safe to be a patient in hospital across any day of the week, you can't, the methods that they were suggesting to try and bring improvements were, as I said, illogical, because as junior doctors, there's only so many of us, and you already have essentially probably the bare minimum to run the standard of the service that you currently have. So changing our contract would not have changed any of this. That we need more doctors in this country is what we actually need. And so we were unable to get back to around the table properly. We were unable to get beyond the impasse. And so the only option we had, and this would have been in 2015, the only option, as you said at that point, was that we had to ballot for industrial action, because we had reached such an impasse that they were unwilling to get back around the table with us. And so the industrial action was very much to get back around that table, to get to a better contract, and to prevent imposition of a contract that would have been incredibly harmful for doctors and for patients.
Wasn't it also the case, though, that it was is what I've described in the past as an inside-out type of industrial dispute, because in many ways the movement for industrial action came not initially from inside the BMA, but almost from outside on the groundswell of opinion. And I remember that I recall there were quickly organised demonstrations in the evenings outside the Department of Health offices if there was rumoured to be a meeting, people walking off shift in scrubs, and then there was a 20,000 junior doctors and supporters in scrubs one Saturday afternoon, I remember as well. So it was a very sort of vibrant social, and very much something organised through social media.
Yeah,
a big, huge Facebook group and all sorts.
Yeah, I think we really did utilise technology. There was a definite drive from what I describe as grassroots members, actually. So, but I mean, I say that, but equally, I think there was an appetite from the Junior Doctors Committee at that time for industrial action, because of the fact that we had, even before it reached the national attention and before it reached the social media attention, we had had a year of back and forth with the government, essentially. So we walked away from those negotiations in 2014, and then we ended up balloting basically a year later. And so we had had a very frustrating year of trying our very best to get to a point where we could negotiate further. And so I think, and had been trying to, certainly I remember being sort of chair of the East Midlands, and it's towards the end of my term as chair of the East Midlands of that year, organising meetings that were growing in size, where I tried to explain the difficulties that we were having. And partly we were helped by some of the public statements that were made by the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, at the time, because he said some things along the lines of, for example, people not working weekends, doctors not working weekends. And then the grassroots campaign of #I'mAtWorkJeremy came about. And so that then helped provide some of the groundswell of support for the work that we were already trying to do in terms of explain the facts of the contractual dispute that we were already sort of in. And so I think partly it was the fact that there were these public statements made that so clearly did not understand how we worked as a profession, how we worked as an NHS, that invoked a lot of anger. And that anger, therefore, kind of gave us that support to then be able to take the contractual matters forwards. And I have no doubt that a number of people who came on our protests perhaps didn't necessarily know the ins and outs of the contract, but they knew some of the ignorance that had been shown by those who control our careers, and they were extremely frustrated about it. Okay. And also, you know, we worked with the grassroots groups. So the leader of the committee at that time, so one of my predecessors, Johan Malawana, he was regularly in touch with kind of grassroots campaigners. And I think he recognised the fact that it was important for these voices to be heard, in addition to those of the trade union, because it showed that we were in line with what junior doctors as a whole wanted. And so our campaigning, our strikes that we were organising was very much supported by the greater body of junior doctors. And those strikes were incredibly effective. When you compare the kind of contract they were trying to impose on us with the one that eventually was imposed on us, it's a world apart. So it got us back around the table. We were able to negotiate a much better position, granted not to one that was acceptable to the entire membership in the end, but one that was much better. So the strikes were, we sometimes hear that from some critics that the strikes didn't achieve what they were set out to achieve, but they certainly achieved a lot.
And I suppose for people listening, just so it's clear, we're only talking about the contract in England, because health is devolved to the nation. So Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales have separate contracts.
Yeah, so they're all on on slightly different versions of the 2002 contract, which is what we used to be on in England. And so yeah, but they all have minor differences because of sort of small negotiations they've had with their own devolved establishments.
Okay. you're the first woman to be elected as chair of the Junior Doctors Committee, and I suppose all of my experience over the years of researching the medical profession shows that it isn't a profession that moves quickly. In many ways, it does in some ways, but in many ways it doesn't. And in the sense, the BMA has, amongst trade unions, has also not necessarily been seen as the most progressive when it came to moving with demands for diversity and inclusion. So what has been your experience as a woman leader in the BMA?
I'm not the first woman leader in JDC. What I am at present is the only woman branch of practice chair of the main branches of practice in the BMA, but there were female chairs that came before me as chair of the Junior Doctors Committee. I actually think the Junior Doctors Committee has been probably a lot more progressive than other parts of the association over the years. I was reflecting the other day, actually, we've not had a chair of the Junior Doctors Committee who was a cisgender white heterosexual male for as long as I can remember, actually. So I think as a committee in and of ourselves, I think we're quite progressive. And our current membership as a committee, we've had majority female, and we seem to have matched the demographics in terms of gender of our membership and of the junior doctor body as a whole for a while. However, being a woman in leadership in medico-politics in general, I think, is still a challenging position to be in. When I first joined the BMA, so 2013 type time, the Junior Doctors Committee itself was going through this period of reflection about gender. And so I think that's partly why we are somewhat ahead of kind of some other bodies within medicine, in that we're quite diverse. The rest of the association has had its issues, and you know, last year there was published an independent report from Daphne Romney QC, who looked into issues of sexism that had been reported within the BMA, and had kind of particularly stemmed from some of the other branch of practice committees. And so there are definite challenges there. I think, again, reflecting on it in general, there have been times when I, as kind of the junior doctor representative into some rooms, and I'm there as the BMA rep, but with perhaps other bodies within medicine, like Royal Colleges and things like that. Again, they've been largely male rooms, particularly a few years ago. I think this is changing, but it is sometimes slightly intimidating, I think, particularly being sort of a younger woman in some of these rooms. And so I've had to learn certain skills to be able to ensure that my voice is heard and to feel comfortable and confident to be able to represent the views of my members in some of those places. I think the BMA, reflecting on the BMA itself, it has got a bit of a reputation for being a bit old boys clubby certainly when I first joined it. And what's interesting though, I think, is that I think if you looked at any of the old medical organisations, the Royal Colleges, and places like that, I believe this is a problem that all of them will have, and I just think that a light has been shone on it in the BMA, particularly, as I said, with the Daphne Romney report. There have been genuine efforts being made to change that. So when I first joined the association, there was a big debate around having sort of gender maxima for our elections to our council, for example, or having reserved seats for women, I think was initially how it was described. And we do now have I can't remember what the actual wording is, but I think it's sort of gender maxima or something for seats to our UK council. And there's been another drive since the work from Romney to try and improve the experience of being a woman in the wider association. So we currently have a female chair of the representative body, and she has recently established a network of elected women. So we now have an internal body that is there. It's very new at the moment, but it's meant to be kind of role modelling and encouraging people to put themselves forward for leadership positions. We're still in the position as an association where we've never had a male chair. We've never had a female chair of council. We've never had a female chair of our GP committee, for example. So we still have a very long way to go. And I'm hopeful that some of the excellent female leaders that have come through the committee that I chair will be the driving force of change in some of those places. But we want that to happen sooner rather than later. I think sometimes there's a temptation to kind of say, well, inevitably it will change because the demographic of the profession is changing, and so we'll have more women coming through, and there will obviously therefore eventually be a female leader. But I don't think that's good enough. I think we have to be proactive in encouraging female leaders to step forwards now and not just wait for that to come through the system, and know that the old kind of old boys club systems will die out eventually.
I think it's very impressive. You were saying before we started the meeting that you literally get hundreds of emails a day, and COVID has posed a whole new set of challenges for you. Could you just tell us, or just give us a sense of what you're up against and what you're trying to achieve?
It's an interesting time to be a leader in any form of setting in healthcare at the moment. So, as I said, I was elected to my current role as chair in September 2019. And we had this plan of work that we wanted to do. We had just struck a new contract deal. So I was part of the team that negotiated our new contract as one of the officer team. And so we'd just come to a contract deal. We'd secured lots of funding for lots of changes that we were making. And so I was anticipating I would have a fairly quiet year after many years of unrest with the contractual dispute, of implementing the changes that we had negotiated and that we had agreed upon with government, after what was actually quite a successful, very different to the period with the strikes. So this was quite a successful and actually comparatively amicable set of negotiations with employers and with the Department of Health and Social Care and Matt Hancock. So I was expecting, as I said, this year of sort of implementation, getting everyone onto solid ground, re-establishing our negotiating relationship with employers, setting up those groups again. And then within sort of 5-6 months, then clearly the pandemic struck. And all the work we had planned was put aside, and we had to work to react to a whole range of sudden issues that none of us could have foreseen. There's no precedent for a lot of the work that we're currently doing as a union and as a committee. The challenges we're dealing with around things like how do you ensure that you're rostering your workforce in a safe way that's safe for doctors and safe for patients, and in a sustainable way because of how long this crisis has been going on, but with the pressures that we are facing, is incredibly difficult, and has been quite a significant challenge. And it's not just that, it's also the contracts. Towards the beginning of the pandemic, we had real problems with PPE and availability of personal protective equipment. And we heard really harrowing reports of some staff not having access to the equipment they needed to protect themselves in the workplace. So there were real health and safety issues there that we were acting on. Impacts on our pay, huge impacts on our training. So with lots of elective work being cancelled, we're now facing the situation where most of our surgical trainees, their logbook numbers for procedures are down by 50%. And so they're not getting the training they need to become consultant surgeons, and that will store up problems for the future. Recruitment into our specialties has obviously been hugely impacted. Every aspect of being a junior doctor obviously has been impacted by this. And so leading the committee through that has been a much bigger challenge than I had anticipated. And I've learned a lot about leadership, I think, in a very short period of time. But in some ways, being chair of JDC, the Junior Doctors Committee, has always meant responding to crises. And every time I think you think it's going to be a normal year, and I'm sure my predecessors all felt this, something seems to happen. So all you can do, I think, is carry on, try your best, utilize the networks that we have. You know, as I said, I chair a committee of 80 excellent representatives from around the country. And so the work I do as chair is very much just part of a greater team. And so I believe strongly in empowering your team to do the jobs that they need to do. And as chair, your role is often kind of oversight and sort of the organisational side of things, but you can't do it without an excellent team around you. And I'm lucky because I do have a very excellent team. But yes, the emails are a problem. I get sort of a couple of hundred emails a day, and I do still work clinically, so I spend half my week working as chair, and then I spend half my week working on a neonatal intensive care unit. So when I'm doing a 13-hour NICU shift, doesn't leave a lot of time for emails, because I basically eat, sleep, go to work, look after the tiny babies, go home. And so then when I go back to my BMA days, I've got kind of 200 to 600 emails waiting for me, in addition to the ones that continue to come in. So it's been an interesting challenge trying to figure out new ways of managing that, but yeah.
I have one final question before we go back to Catherine and everybody else. What about the future? I mean, you talked about you coming towards the end of your core speciality training, and presumably consultant paediatrician. What about the BMA for you?
I mean, it is interesting, because I think I'll be a junior doctor for a while yet, because so I'm currently in so paediatrics is an 8-year training program. I'm currently in my 3rd year, despite having started it in 2016, because I'm working half time because of my leadership role.
Of course,
so I have a number of years to the junior doctor. Though having chaired the committee, I don't want to be sort of a backseat driver. That said, as I've said, I will always be a trade unionist, and I will always be passionate about the role of the trade union. So whatever I do, I imagine I will continue to do rep work as a trade unionist. There are other parts of the association that I'd be interested to get involved in, perhaps at a national level on the council and things like that. But I will at some point step aside, and someone else will take forwards the role of the chair of the committee. And concentrating on my kind of career for a little bit as well, I think is probably going to be a sensible option. I have some research interests I'd be quite keen to pursue. So, but certainly, as I said, yeah, I think the role of the BMA is essential. Obviously, I'm biased in saying that, but I feel very strongly that it is, and I'll be continuing to kind of support it however I can.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Catherine.
Thank you. That was so interesting, and I must admit I've got all sorts of questions that I wish to ask, which I hope to get the opportunity to do so. But I wonder if what we can do is, if people have got questions, if they could raise their hand at this point, and then we'll collect together 2 or 3 questions together to ask, and then we'll put those to Sarah. But if I could ask you, when you do speak, that if you could just say who you are and where you're from, because I know there are some people within the university, within different departments across different universities, and from outside. So it would be useful to Sarah and to all of us to know who you are and what you do. So if you want to start raising hands, and I think I might take this opportunity whilst you're thinking about your questions to just ask one of my own, which was, Sarah, you mentioned that from your very first weeks, you're just literally weeks out of medical school, you're already embroiled within this issue of seeing things were not right and having to fight for those breaks. And I wondered what that very early impact had on you in terms of how your career as it progressed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because as I kind of alluded to, there are a lot of rota gaps across the UK, and we know there's a lot of departments who operate on quite low levels of staff, and so I think there's an extent to which an understaffing almost becomes an expected part of the work that you do, and there's a fine line, I think, between having a challenging shift where it's very busy and you have to prioritise different kind of aspects of the work you have to do, and different people getting sick and things like that, and before it tips into being unsafe. And I think sometimes it can be challenging, for particularly when you're a very new junior doctor, to be able to tell what is unsafe and what is just a kind of a very challenging shift, which is the nature of our jobs. And I think for me, when I first started doing these shifts and found them very difficult, I initially assumed that it was because I was a very new doctor and I was inexperienced, and therefore the workload was just because I was new and didn't know what I was doing. And I think that's incredibly common. And I mentioned that it was towards the end of my first year as a doctor that I actually did this survey, and that was because I, towards the end of the year, was still hearing people saying how difficult the shifts were. And so I reflected, well, it can't just have been me. Everyone's having this experience, and they're still having this experience towards at the end of a year of being a doctor, whereas I was only a few weeks out. So so I think initially I put it, as I said, I think I put it down to, oh, you know, I've only been out of medical school a short period of time, and it's probably me. But again, I wonder how much of this comes back to things like imposter syndrome. I think there is a propensity to blame yourself and not the system. And the important thing for the healthcare system to learn, and for those kind of leaders, I guess, in healthcare to learn, those in leadership roles within trusts and things, is that you need to empower your staff to have confidence in their own abilities and have confidence in what they're seeing, because the most important thing is that these things are picked up, because the point is that you may see things as a very junior member of staff that more senior colleagues aren't privy to, so they don't necessarily know what you're experiencing when you're there by yourself on a weekend or of an evening. And so it's incredibly important for NHS organisations to have a no blame learning culture, so that people are able to raise it as and when these things happen. But that needs to be instilled from the very beginning of people's careers. The entire reason as I said, that I brought all this legal action through and when I raised it initially, was because I believe in raising concerns around not sweeping things onto the carpet, around shining a light on areas where there are changes to be made, but not to be punitive, and not to be kind of punishing people for these things, but to ensure that changes can be made. And there's loads of evidence to show that that's the way to kind of approach these things. But I think it needs to be highlighted to new junior doctors. To be honest, even if you're a new junior doctor and you are struggling and you're finding it difficult because you're a new doctor, that's okay. And they need to be building in mechanisms to ensure that those people are supported, because it's not just better for them, it's better for patients as well. So I think, to answer your original question, what it instilled upon me was an even greater belief in the fact that the systems themselves need to be built to reflect these difficulties, but also to be learning systems that pick up on these issues and don't hide them, because that's better for everybody involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, it's clearly so important that those things are picked up. Okay, so Paul has posted a question in the chat about, is the BMA likely to join the Trade Union Congress?
It's a big question, isn't it? Because it's an ongoing thing that the BMA is not part of it. I don't think so at present. It will be a kind of a question for council and things like that. And I'm sure there are historical reasons as to why they haven't. But I don't know the details, I'm afraid. We have previously joined in campaigns, and I believe we've joined in kind of days of kind of protests and things like that alongside the TUC, and we work very closely with other unions, particularly the other sort of NHS unions. But yes, part of the Congress itself, I don't think is at the moment.
Okay, so any other questions coming to mind from people?
See some hands.
Catherine, we've got hands up.
Oh, I can't see. Oh, right here, that was very slow coming through here. So Maurizio, I have a question from as the first one. Are there any more at this point, or we'll hand over?
And Ying as well.
Hold on, let me just. I'm going to get a different view on my screen so I can actually see these.
You need the participant.
Bob raised his hand before me.
Okay, so actually, it's very slow at this end here. Sorry, the hands are coming, but very slowly. So I'll start with Maurizio and then Ying, if you both would like to say who you are and your role, and then we'll hand both questions over to Sarah. So Maurizio.
Yes, thanks a lot. I can't say Sarah or anybody else, but it might be my connection. I'm currently visiting professor at the center, and based the rest of my time in Argentina, where I work at the Center for Labor Relations, which is part of the National Research Council of Argentina. I thanks a lot Sarah for her presentation. I think it's really important to have this frontline experiences and discuss with people like you. I think my question relate more to to your organization's strategic role compared to other trade unions or association of workers organization. So how do you deal with the fact that you have power in terms of forcing your employer to accept certain condition, but at the same time responsibility with patients?
Thank you, Maurizio. And then Ying, if you'd like to pose your question too.
Actually, Bob raised his hand way earlier than I did.
Oh, so
yeah,
Bob,
he raised his hand literally. Yeah.
Bob's texted and he says he can't seem to make himself visible.
Oh, that's interesting, because no, I can't see Bob's hands up at all.
No, I can't. So maybe just let him speak.
Yeah, so Bob, over to you then, and then Ying. So Bob, we can't hear you either.
Right, is that better?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right, thanks Sarah for your presentation, which I enjoyed, and commend you for your resilience and bravery. What I want to return to is the idea of unsafe working conditions, and particularly those around understaffing, which are obviously chronic. And it seems to me that part of the goodwill of staff is used against them by making them complicit almost in unsafe conditions, so that constantly under the threat that if something goes wrong, it's not the system that gets blamed, it's the individual, through breaching your codes of practice, if that's what it's called. So I really want to know, what's the strategy for dealing with this? Because one of the obvious responses has been whistleblowing, but that leaves people very exposed, very threatened, and it's also an incredibly individualistic way of dealing with it. It's a declaration of failure of trade union organisation and action, which takes me to the core of the question, which is also about how do you organise on the ground in order to deal with these sorts of things. And there is someone who's put together a strategy for this, and you almost certainly have heard of him, if not this particular aspect of what he talks about, and that's Roger Klein, who envisaged a way of combining professional standards with trade union action, by claiming that employers were breaching their contract if they insisted that you acted in these ways, and a way in which you could raise collective confidence and consciousness and convert what is a very powerful thing amongst doctors and other health service workers, which is their desire for the best for their patients, and to use that wellspring as a way of organising. You've already said in your own personal instance how important patient care is. So there's a number of questions there that are all wrapped together. So I'll allow you to unpack them and perhaps answer as you feel appropriate.
So what I think we'll do is we'll hand over to Sarah now, because I think there's a lot in those two questions, and then Ying will come on to you and some other questions in the next batch. So Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're both really interesting questions, and they are also they're almost linked, I think. So the first question was around how we as a medical trade union, I think, are able to balance our responsibility to our members in terms of improving working conditions with our responsibility to patients. And I suppose what I've been talking about, because of the fact that as the Junior Doctors Committee we organised strike action, means that we have had to think about these concerns, and we have had to talk about these things in the last few years, if not in the last 2 years, certainly in 2015, 2016. I think what it comes back to is the fact that our patients remain our #1 concern. And I think even when we're thinking about our working conditions, and I think you will find this of most clinicians, and you will find it of the way that we talk about our campaigns as an association, is that it does come back to patients. As I said earlier, for me, trade unionism is a no-brainer because it's about looking after your fellow human beings, and improving the working lives of people, which I genuinely believe will overall kind of improve society. And if you want kind of a utilitarian aspect, probably improve like the health of the nation. But certainly when it comes to the health industry, that then links to the safety of patients. So by making things better and safer for your staff, not only are you improving their lives, but you're improving patient safety and you're improving what you're able to give to patients. Because on the opposite side of it, if you underpay, if you force your staff to work more hours than they should, if you take away their facilities and their ability to have rest during shifts, you will harm patient safety. And so it's incredibly important that we are able to do that. So I think as an association and as a trade union, often what you find is that, and this is what we did with our campaign around contracts, is that we do concentrate on the aspects that will harm patient safety. So we, a lot of our concerns around that contract that they tried to impose on us was around safety aspects and the ability to monitor for whether or not our shifts and our working patterns were safe, shift patterns that we thought might be unsafe. But then even some of the arguments that we were making around what we saw as being very unfair approaches to our pay, you also can link to patient safety, because if you have staff leaving, not retaining doctors within the system, forcing people like they feel like they want to go abroad and work in Australia, that will also harm patient safety, because we aren't retaining doctors, we aren't recruiting doctors in the system, and therefore fair pay is also comes back to a patient safety issue. So and that's a strong driver as to why I'm involved, is because of not only the fact that I think that it's incredibly important to make sure we are well paid and we are working in safe environments just on a human level for the impact on individuals in those circumstances, but because it means that we give better care at the end of the day. To answer Bob's question, I completely agree with you, and I do think that the NHS has for a very long time run on the goodwill of staff, and on kind of free hours that people put in because they care, but there is, and I do agree that there is a concern amongst staff that if things go wrong, then they will be blamed individually and not the system. And so part of this is about driving that cultural change I was talking about, in terms of how do you make the NHS a learning organisation and not a blame organisation? And when things go wrong, how do you look at it from a system perspective? And how do you identify the system problems that happened and not point the finger at the individual? Because one of the biggest cases recently that came to the attention of the medical profession was of someone called Dr Bauer-Garber, who and this was a case that some of you may have seen, but she was working in an incredibly pressured and difficult and challenging environment, and unfortunately a patient passed away, and she was the medical registrar, and a lot of the blame in the end was pointed towards her, and that's caused a great deal of concern in the medical profession, because when you unpick the case, it's clear she was working under extraordinary pressure. And there's lots of evidence that shows that when you are put under that amount of pressure, you might respond in different ways to what you would normally respond. And there are models such as things like the Swiss cheese model, if you're aware of this, which is basically the notion where you can have lots of safeguards in to prevent something happening, and then you'll have a series of systemic failings that all line up. And the individual is only one part of that system, but often when an error happens, it's because all the other holes in that Swiss cheese have lined up, and you've managed to get, and so the incident has kind of slipped through. But the point is that it's not necessarily that individual's fault, because there were other checks in the system that should have been in place to ensure that did not happen. So it's around identifying, doing root cause analysis to identify what those safeguards were that have been missed. But that takes cultural change. And there are people in the NHS who are pushing for that, but I think we can do yet more. In terms of a strategy, so part of it, I believe, is you need to build it into the systems that exist. So with our most recent iteration of our contract that was published, we have included something called exception reporting, which is essentially an audit tool that means that junior doctors, if they miss their breaks, if they work too many hours, if we've also included it to include educational things, or if they're not getting the training they need, they can file very quickly and easily an exception report, which is kind of like an online tool. And it has a double effect. It also means that they can get paid for those hours, or they can get the time back. But there's also somebody who is called the Guardian of Safe Working, who is a senior member of staff in the association, who oversees all of these reports and therefore can pick up on hotspots and identify pressure points, and then raise that with the management of the trust to try and get changes made. And we've seen good examples of this being utilised to ensure more staff are employed, or changes to the rotas are made to try and relieve some of those pressure points. I don't think it's a perfect system yet, because it involves an individual having to file a report, and so therefore for some I think it can feel a little bit exposing, and so I think there are more improvements we can probably make, but that is an example of something we've tried to bring in order to be able to pick up on those hotspots, and sort of like as I said, as like an audit tool essentially of what that is, and we've built that into the contract, so it can't be you're not going to get into trouble for it, because it's part of what you're expected to do as a junior doctor. And it's around making sure that the unions are active within those trusts, that again, if there are concerns, a bit like the ones I had when I was a very junior doctor, that you're able to have a forum where that can be raised and listened to and changes brought. But I think it needs leadership from the very top of the NHS to show that that is the way that they want to approach. The other thing, of course, is we need more staff, and that's something we've been lobbying on for a long time. We have now got more medical students coming into the system, so they've invested a lot of money into producing more medical school places, and we've just had a load of new medical schools open. So, for example, Lincoln has just opened a medical school, which is being currently you get a degree from Nottingham if you go there, but will eventually become an independent medical school. And they've put these new medical schools into parts of the country which are currently under-doctored as well. So when the extra medical school places went out, they've tried to target them towards populations that are under-doctored, which I think is a positive thing. But we need yet more, and we also need guarantees of the funding to ensure that these doctors, when they come into the system, have jobs and have the funding that they need for their training as well, which is the other flip side of it. But I think we are making progress in that area, because we do have more doctors that will be coming into the system in 5 or 6 years' time. There's always going to be a lag, because unfortunately it takes that long to train us, but we're driving in that direction, I think.
Okay, great. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sarah. And then, so over to you, Ying, if you would like to ask your question.
Actually, my question is very similar to Mauricio's, just phrased in different wording, so I'm probably not going to ask that, but thank you very much, Sarah, for your presentation.
Okay, and then in that case, there's a question in the chat, which is, to what extent is the BMA fighting against the unreasonable restrictions that the Home Office is forcing on medical staff from other countries, e.g. visas, NHS charges, etc.?
Fighting a lot is supposed to be the answer to that. So we have an entire international department who are experts in this, and so the way the BMA works, just to explain as well, is that there are elected members like myself who are doctors working on the ground, and who understand the environment of being a doctor and what we face. But we have a huge number of excellent staff who are not medical, but so we have a whole floor of sort of comms team. In our international department, we have people with a legal background who really understand the ins and outs of employment law and the immigration system and visas and things like that. So so we are fighting on many different things on that. So we played a big role, I think, in lobbying for some of the recent kind of visa issues that have been highlighted because of COVID, and on kind of like right to remain and things like that. So, but there's huge amounts of work I know that is ongoing. The NHS staff charges as well is something we have been lobbying on, and I believe obviously we have made progress on that recently, but there continues to be issues in that area. So I think we have long kind of, as an association, sort of acknowledged and celebrated the role that international medical staff play in the role of the NHS, we'd be unable to run a health service without them. So they, we have to value them. We should not be treating them unfairly in the way that many of these restrictions does cause. There are some specific training issues that we've been lobbying on as well in terms of restrictions that, because of the visa requirements, that mean that you can't do things like work flexibly in some of the opportunities that exist for people who are not from abroad, and so that's incredibly unfair as well. So yes, a number of different areas we're currently working on through our excellent colleagues in the international department.
So there seems to be an issue with the hand raising situation. So Salma, I believe, has also got her hand up, though it's not appearing at all on my screen. So if there's anybody else who's also got their hand up that I can't see, please just put a note in the chat to let me know. So Salma, over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. I'm a PhD student at University of Leicester, and I'm investigating the work and career experiences of BAME doctors. And my question is related to BAME doctors. As we discussed about diversity in terms of gender at leadership levels, I was just wondering about diversity in terms of ethnic backgrounds. Both from your medic experience, as well as your position at BMA. So what do you think? What is the situation there from ethnic background? Thank you.
Incredible. Shall I just answer this now, Catherine?
Yes, I think I can't see that there's any other hands up at the moment.
Yeah, incredibly important work, Salma, to answer your question, and it's something that we have had a big focus on recently as an association. So we are currently in the process of bringing together a BME forum. I know the term BME at the moment is under scrutiny itself, and I'm looking for alternative kind of phrases to use. I think BME is the best one we have at the moment, but please do let me know if there's a better phrase I should be using. And I think with everything that's happened this year with Black Lives Matter and those campaigns, a light has really been shone on the importance of this work. It's something that I know the NHS has been looking at for a while as well, and there's been some really important work done looking at the experiences of staff members within the NHS who are from BME backgrounds and the prejudice that they face. That it's fairly well established that it's essentially that the more melanin you have in your skin, so the darker your skin colour, the worse experience that you sometimes have as a staff member in the NHS. And it's incredibly important that that is tackled. And seeing leadership positions and people who are BME in leadership positions is really important. I have to say that I think this is the area we may have further to go actually as an association and as the BMA on some of our committees, even than gender. So it's something I'm particularly interested in on the committee that I chair. And so it's something that we will be looking at in the year to come. As I've said, we are forming this BME forum within our association, which hopefully will help drive that forwards. And I hope to work with them to improve that. We've also been doing some work as a committee where we've been reaching out to groups of doctors who represent doctors from BME backgrounds to try and sort of advertise our committee to them a bit more strongly, so as to encourage people to run. And there are some amazing organisations within medicine, people like there's an organisation called Melanin Medics who are doing some incredible work advocating for medical students and doctors from sort of a Black background, and so looking to do more work with those as well going forwards. So I think there is a bit of a spotlight on this work at the moment, but we're at the beginning of a journey there, and there remains a lot of work to be done in that area for us and for other parts of the NHS.
Then we have another question in the chat, which is from a colleague of ours in the School of Business, Will Green, who is clearly demonstrating some of those issues about working at home during COVID, because he's got his kids in the background, and hence the question is in the chat and not audio. So he says, great presentation, Sarah, thank you. I wanted to know whether and how the BMA can leverage the support for the NHS workforce going through COVID-19 moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, isn't it? We are in an interesting position, I think, as staff in the NHS at the moment, where there was this real upswell of support for us during the first wave, and we are now in, I think we all feel very fatigued, and it's whether that kind of support does continue, because we're going to be entering into a very interesting period with things like the vaccine, and you know, you see these people kind of denying kind of the impact of COVID and things like that. So I think we have a public relations battle, first of all, I think, that we're going to need to fight. That said, I agree. I think the outswelling of support, particularly in the first wave, has been amazing. And it's how to sort of leverage that. It's difficult because, you know, we do that anyway, I think, as the health service. And it's certainly something we have been utilising in the past, because genuinely, I think, when we go into negotiations, we do so with pretty pure motives, and it's genuinely about trying to improve the lives of staff and therefore patients. COVID-19, I think, has shone a light on some of the pressures that exist, and so already we're starting to see some changes. So, for example, we weren't prepared from an intensive care bed perspective. We already knew that we regularly struggle for intensive care beds. And so the government has already agreed to increase the number of intensive care trainees that will be trained, so as to try and equip us slightly better from a staffing perspective. So I think the way to leverage these changes going forwards is to use the fact that COVID has shone a real light on some of the issues that exist in the system, to point those out, and then to work towards solutions that I think COVID has also shown us in some areas as well. For example, kind of technology and the use of technology in the NHS. I think there will be an increasing role for things like video consultations where appropriate and things, and making sure that's used when that's used in the right way, I think will be beneficial for staff and for patients. And whereas that would have taken years to enact before, it's been essentially rushed through. So it's finding those things and highlighting them and ensuring that they continue, whilst also highlighting the things that are bad that have been shown through the pandemic, such as understaffing, such as our A&E departments that were already during the winter often on their knees, and I dread to think what's going to happen over this winter. But it shows that there is a real case for change that has to be made, and I hope that the public would support the NHS and support unions in driving for that, because of I think, to be honest, the selfless way in which many NHS staff have behaved over the last year. I'm in awe of my colleagues who work in intensive care departments. It's the work they've done has been unending, exhausting, and I'm imagining, incredibly emotionally draining. And we need to see something reflected in that going forwards from the government.
Paul.
Just a quick one, Sarah. Catherine and I have another PhD student who can't be here today, and her research is into looking at the gender imbalances across the specialities. And I was wondering to what extent the BMA is doing something about it and feels able to really push on those specialities where there is an horrendous gender imbalance.
Yeah, I mean, it's another example of an area where things are changing, but perhaps not quick enough. I did an interview actually with your student about it. So I think, to answer the question, I think the work that we're doing is around pushing for. So it's almost like looking at the barriers that exist, and it's looking to say, okay, in some of these specialties, and I have to say it tends to be more of the craft specialties, surgical specialties, where we still see these gender imbalances. It's like, right, what are the barriers that are standing in the way of people being able to get more involved who are not from that typical kind of background that tend to go into these specialties? We do work with the Royal Colleges, and we work with the trainee organisations that represent those kinds of doctors. So we work quite closely with the Association of Surgeons in Training, perhaps the orthopaedic trainees, and the other kind of Royal College trainees across the board. And there are some really excellent initiatives going on to try and get women into surgery and other kind of career pathways that are less that are still currently male dominated. I think the other thing that we're doing that should hopefully make a difference is as I've said, some of the flexibility initiatives that we're driving forward. So, for example, we have always been kind of a driving force behind working less than full time, and the ability to work less than full time becoming not just available and available to all junior doctors, but also culturally more acceptable. We recently managed to negotiate for shared parental leave for junior doctors, which was a huge kind of win associated with our contractual negotiations. And so therefore, again, some of the barriers to some of these specialties comes with things like flexible working, but also parental leave, and the fact that more often falls to women. And therefore, when we now have the ability for both male and female junior doctors to share that parental leave. And so hopefully that will again be able to improve some of these situations in some of these specialties that were seen as inaccessible. Yeah, so flexible working. And the other thing that goes hand in hand with this, I think, is around making sure our working patterns allow you to have that life alongside your medical career. So I hope that we are beyond the days of they are unable to kind of work in a pattern that allows them to be, also involved in their family lives, and that's for both men and women. That driving that forwards again will help improve the gender equality. So ensuring that we get our rotas in a time that allows for us to plan caring commitments, for example. And we've recently managed to get agreement to contractualise our rota notice periods, which should again make an improvement there. So I think some of the work that we do in improving flexibility and improving working lives will also eventually have an impact on these specialties that have traditionally seemed very male dominated.
Anne-Marie.
Hi Sarah, thank you very much for that presentation and such a kind of personal and honest reflection on a number of things. I had to nip out right at the beginning of the question, so I apologise if I'm repeating anything, but I was actually thinking more about your views on collective capacity. I was just thinking about the fact that in the end you had to take the law case forward by yourself, and so having had a group of you were then sort of left alone. And I do kind of, and because of the energy and the length of time it takes and the extent to which you put your head above the parapet and so on, and it is a little bit, it's nothing like it really, but there are kind of some comparisons to how we feel in universities when we're trying to mobilise for industrial action and for protest, and that whole thing about hurt to students, hurt to patients, that kind of wider thing is very difficult to overcome. And I was wondering whether or not you've talked about some successes which appear to be kind of regulatory and things that might not be pushing the boundaries too much, but to what extent are people just too exhausted to have collective capacity to do stuff? And around grievances.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I'm sure the reason that the reason that I was alone in the court case that I did was not because people didn't care about these issues. It's because it's scary to put your head above the parapet and kind of put yourself out there, because just the nature of doing it, and you worry about sort of your long-term impacts on your career. So I think there's that, but also I agree it's probably fatigue, and it's the fact that if you are working in conditions that are stressful, you're much less likely actually to have the energy to then engage in kind of some form of active sort of dispute or kind of battling against it. So I mean, it's a difficult one, and actually I do think it's something that we do struggle with in medicine, and we struggle with kind of I guess a degree of apathy when it comes to action. I mean, I think it is around it's an age-old question, but I think it is around identifying those touch points and those things that really resonate with people, and also when you organise, obviously, if you can make it easy for people to get involved, so which they have to do in order to kind of show their support or be part of the movement, if they can be relatively small to begin with, I think that helps, because then you're taking people on the journey with you, and you're getting them involved, but you're not necessarily asking too much from them in terms of time. It does mean that those of you who are organisers kind of bear the brunt of that a little bit, but it's challenging to find ways around that. As I've said, I'm very lucky in terms of the support that I get offered by the staff at the BMA, and that makes a big difference, I think. So I think it's partly organising around that cause, and finding ways that people can be involved without asking more than they can give from them, if that makes sense. I mean, I think it's an age-old question, isn't it? It's a really question for anyone involved in trade union organisation. And because the other thing as well is around is making sure that you are communicating effectively and in the right ways with people, so that they see the work that you're doing, and so that they know that this stuff is going on, and then it inspires them to become involved, and they know they can drive change. Because I think seeing success stories helps people feel enthusiastic, and a number of our reps who are now kind of involved in our key members in our union and in our movement first got involved because of kind of a campaign on a particular issue that we then kind of won, and then have been carried forwards through into the association and now do lots of other stuff. So so some of it's about communication as well, I think. And again, that's also an age-old problem, social media, emails, what do people actually look at and read and get engaged with, and making yourself visible on the shop floor, as it were.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that brings us almost exactly to 3:30, and on my screen I can't see any more hands up, so I hope that's reflective of the reality.
No, there is one more hand.
Oh, that's mine now, but is there whose hand?
Alan Scott. Scott Allen, sorry.
Scott, in that case, the last question to you.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for reversing my name and then correcting yourself, because it so often is reversed. Sarah, thanks very much. I'll state an interest in this. I'm a lecturer in Aberdeen, but my wife is a hospital consultant. So I suppose one of the things that I know she's wrestled with, and I've never come up with any good answer to, is the push-pull factor that has come in vis-a-vis the fight for junior doctors having acceptable working conditions, and the knock-on effect for the consultants, I suppose. You've spoken about the necessity for patient care to continue, and I think all doctors and right-thinking people would agree with that. What I'm interested in is how you've dealt with, or how you feel you will deal with, that tension of knowing that the better you fight the fight for one group, there's an inevitable, at least short to medium term, impact on the others, because they in effect have to, if you like, pick up the slack. And I know from my own experience that doesn't mean that they're blaming the junior doctors, because of course they've gone through the workload themselves, but at the same time they're aware that they're the ones who have to stay back at the ranch to make sure that the care continues whilst the breaks are taken, and so on and so forth. So I was really just interested in how you make sense of that and where you see that going, whilst accepting that there's obviously a systematic problem in this, but the systematic problem doesn't get resolved immediately. So there is the knock-on problem as well. So that's what I was interested in.
Yeah, you're quite right. And it is a really complicated issue. First of all, I mean, I think so consultants and GPs and our senior colleagues have been incredibly supportive of our kind of struggles over the last few years. And we could not have taken industrial action if it wasn't for their support, because when we did our full walkouts, it was the consultants who rolled up their sleeves and learned how to do discharge summaries again and all the things they hadn't done since they were junior doctors themselves. So first of all, just to kind of, I think, acknowledge that, because I think that was incredibly important, and that support meant so much to us, and enabled what we were able to do. So I think the thing about us as a trade union is the fact that we work with our branch of practice colleagues. So we have meetings where I will meet with sort of the chair of the consultant committee and things like that. So we do, and we have seats on each other's negotiating kind of committees who oversee the negotiations. And so if we foresee anything that we think is going to have a massive impact, then at least that can be raised during the negotiating processes. The other thing I think for us as junior doctors is that we will all eventually become senior doctors. So whether that's being a GP, whether that's being a consultant. And so we do have a vested interest in making sure that anything we do doesn't have too much of an impact if we can, as far as possible, on creating, you know, misery in the lives of consultants, because it would be shooting ourselves in the foot, because we are going to become consultants, and so that we would want to avoid doing that. I think it kind of it's really it is a genuinely really difficult sort of situation. I think in my kind of in my experience, the difficulties kind of facing consultants are all, as you sort of said, the systemic ones as well, that actually in a department where consultants are struggling with this, it will probably be affecting the junior doctors as well. And so often we're in it together, so it makes sense to try and push for change together. The other aspect as well is that consultants are largely responsible for our training. And so often I find myself lobbying in meetings with Department of Health and things on behalf of consultants as well, because it impacts on junior doctors. Because if the consultants are completely overrun and having to just do service provision, it impacts on us as junior doctors, because we don't get time with our trainers, we don't get trained effectively, and the whole system loses out that way as well. So I think, to answer your question, it's a difficult tension, and it's difficult to know entirely how to resolve it, but it is a tension that we're aware of. It's something we try to mitigate against in various different ways, perhaps not always successfully, based on kind of the fact that you asked the question, which clearly means in some places it's not working. But it is something that we are mindful of, and hopefully try to mitigate as far as possible. I think overall we need more time for consultants to do things like be trainers and be able to have time in their job plans for the thing they want to have time in their job plans for. And I know, again, that this will be a slow progress thing, but hopefully as more doctors come through the system and fill some of those gaps, that will improve matters as well. I think the consultants are currently in the process of negotiating or renegotiating their contract again. So again, we will support them in that and in driving for changes in their contractual provisions, as they did with us too. So it's a symbiotic relationship, I think.
Good, thank you. I suspect that you may find yourself and your colleagues fighting the good fight in the later stages of your career as well, and maybe by bringing that together we'll have some success over time. But thank you very much.
So we are now running slightly over, but that was really a fascinating, really wide-ranging, thought-provoking, and a very personal story in amongst that. And I think would be fair to say, I'd speak for everybody here to say how grateful we also are to you and all your colleagues for everything that you're doing in the current situation, but also normally. And we would wish you best of luck with all of these good things that you're trying to advance. So we very much appreciate your time today. We hope that you haven't received 200 emails while you've been on with us. And thank you very, very much indeed. And thank you to everybody for attending.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for the invite.
Thank you.
It's very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
And we'll catch up with you shortly.
Yes.
Or rather, next few days.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.